Forests are really amazing systems made up of so many interacting parts, kind of like characters in a story. The whole forest is really a story if you take the time to learn how to read it. Forests are really important ecosystems for so many reasons. They provide a lot of habitat and support so much biodiversity worldwide and right here in our backyard as well. They are so important for storing carbon. If we look at how much of the planet's land area is covered in forest, it's only about 30%. But if we look at the amount of carbon that's stored in all of the plants around the world, 80% of that is in forest ecosystems. And the reason that forests are so important for storing carbon really comes down to the trees. Trees are huge plants and they live for a long time, so they store a lot of carbon just locked away in their biomass. Trees also form this sort of 3D architecture of the forest, providing habitat for many other species that are the other important characters in the story of the forest. Things like fungi and insects and small mammals and amphibians, they all find a niche in the architecture provided by the trees. So like any good story, nature is messy and complicated, and some of these messy features like downed branches and dead logs and standing, rotting trees are actually a really important part of the story, and they provide habitat and help to support biodiversity in the forest ecosystem. So this time of year, the leaves are often thought of as a messy part of the forest and something that we spend a lot of time raking up. This whole layer down here is a whole other habitat. It's like a whole other world that's just as sort of big and, full of little niches as the above ground parts of the forest are. So there's all sorts of little creatures that call this stuff home. These leaves are actually an important source of food and energy for the fungi, which are incredibly important players in the story of the forest. Some of the biggest living things in the world are fungi that pop up mushrooms here and there, but underground they're these massive called mycelia or mycelium. There are fungi that connect to the roots of trees and help bring nutrients and water to the tree. So that helps their root system sort of spread out farther and wider, and it helps collect more water and nutrients for them. And then in return, the trees feed them sugars, they feed them carbohydrates. And so it's this symbiotic relationship. We always think of all this competition and it's a dog-eat-dog world and everything is competing with everything else, but it turns out that there's some sharing going on too, which probably benefits all the trees somehow. So just something to think about when we're walking through and kind of trampling all these leaves and not thinking much about what's underfoot, but half of the forest really is under the ground too, with the roots and the fungi and everything else that's going on down there. Once you learn to read the forest, there's so many more stories it can tell. It can tell us about what's happening underground. The plants and trees in an area reflect the soils and geology, and here at Barnum Creek we have things like leatherwood, like maidenhair fern, like basswood, and they all prefer a calcium-rich soil. So this is a maidenhair fern, and ferns are one of those things I think that at first glance they all kind of look the same, but there's a huge diversity of ferns in Ontario, and this is really one of the most beautiful. When you see a patch of them, they're quite stunning because of that sort of circular pattern. So there's another one of the sort of calcium-loving plants. The forest also tells stories of the past and of history, and right behind me is this big old sugar maple. It's very branchy, it's got a lot of lower branches that tell us that it was growing in a more open area. This was more open in the past and it's since grown in, and the leaves on these branches are not getting enough sunlight now, and the tree is starting to lose them because they're not useful to the tree anymore. The forest here at Barnum Creek also tells us stories of the distant past. We have species of plants called club mosses. It's a spore-producing plant, so millions of years ago, these club mosses were tree-sized. These are the parts that produce the spores, and we have, I don't know how many species, probably almost a dozen of them in Ontario, but they all have something that looks sort of like this that produces the spores. They're very, very ancient plants. So let's think bigger and look at the broader landscape. And if we could zoom way out, we would see the landscape as a patchwork quilt full of different textures and patterns and different kinds of forest, old forest, young forest, conifer forest, hardwood forest, and non-forest as well, like this meadow that we're standing in here at Barnum Creek that we've managed this way to keep habitat for different insects and birds and other creatures that really love this kind of a habitat. We also have wetlands on the landscape that provide important habitat too. So all of those different patches together help to support biodiversity on the landscape. So open spaces like this are important patches on the quilt of the landscape because there's enough sunlight here. They provide habitat for shrubs like this hawthorn, and in turn the hawthorn is producing fruits that feeds birds and other wildlife. But it's also a great example of how trees aren't just prisoners of their environment. So you can see that there are some very, very sharp thorns on this hawthorn tree that it uses to protect itself from potential herbivores that are going to try to eat it. And the hawthorn is also a character in another really interesting story, a story of connectivity between the hawthorn and birds that we call shrikes. They will actually use the thorns to store their meal. So they will catch small rodents and insects and pierce them, impale them on these thorns to store them for later. So sometimes they're called the butcher bird because of that sort of grotesque habit that they have. So I'm always looking for signs of that when you walk. So don't be alarmed if you come through here and ever see a little tiny mouse, baby mouse impaled on a thorn. The Haliburton Highlands Land Trust owns and stewards several properties throughout Haliburton County. Each one is a different patchwork on that quilt that is the landscape. And Barnum Creek Nature Reserve and Dahl Forest both have extensive trail systems. So whether it's out here or in your own backyard, take the time to learn the messy, the complicated, the amazing stories of the forest. I still don't see any little rodents on here though. I'm looking.